Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, August 24th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And we'll begin with this one. The title is These Conservatives Want to Be Working Moms, the Manosphere Disapproves. This is by Vivian Yee. The young women bent their heads over their books one morning in July, studying, if such things can be studied, how a woman should be. One of them read aloud from a passage about Mary Wollstonecraft, the early women's rights advocate who had slammed the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau for writing, in her words, that man was made to reason, woman to feel. Kimberly Begg, the president of the Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women, stood at the front of the conference room leading one of her periodic book club sessions for summer interns and young staff members. She had designed this discussion of 18th century ideas specifically to confront a charged new political movement. I actually hear this a lot right now, that women are feelers and men are thinkers, Ms. Begg said. Wollstonecraft is saying if we embrace this, she added, we're going to be not just harming women, but all of society. For the women listening, Rousseau's assessment did not match reality, but it did sound familiar. These days, the idea that women are intellectually inferior leaches steadily from manosphere podcasts, influencers who promote traditional gender roles, and ultra-conservative pulpits. Ms. Begg, a lawyer with 5 children who often draws on her Catholic faith, has heard some conservatives pushing for a return to rigid gender norms, with women firmly planted at home. One of her sons told her that some of his male high school classmates have openly questioned whether women should be able to vote. From a squat brick office park in North Virginia, the Luce Center is staking out what seems like a fraught position these days, that it's possible to be a conservative woman who values motherhood and family, but one with a career, an egalitarian marriage, and a voice. High-powered women are not exactly missing from the conservative world. Trump has hired women for prominent positions, including his chief of staff and press secretary, as well as several in his cabinet, although many of those have left or been fired. Erica Kirk has led Turning Point USA since her husband and the group's founder, Charlie Kirk, was assassinated last year. Many of the Make America Healthy Again movement's biggest stars are women. Yet such women, even those encouraging conventional gender roles, are often told to be quiet. Some red pill conservatives have rebuked Ms. Kirk for her public role away from her children. They have chastised Alex Clark, a star Mahab podcaster, and Brett Cooper, a YouTube commentator, for having a platform. And every summer, it seemed to Ms. Begg, more Luce Center interns have stories about coming face to face with open sexism from classmates, friends, and boyfriends. Mary White, an earnest 19-year-old bookworm in Invisalign braces, found herself debating a male classmate at the University of Dallas about the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Women tend to lean liberal, he told her. Replacing women's suffrage with household voting, in which husbands cast ballots for their wives and families, would fix that, he said, echoing arguments that have circulated online and in far-right circles. Another intern, Lucy Carney, 19, a forthright politics and government major, was the only woman in her class to serve last year in student government at Benedictine College in Kansas. She said she once confronted a male classmate when she heard that he had quoted Andrew Tate, the manosphere influencer accused of rape and human trafficking. So I guess, he said, women just want to be raped. Anastasia Lefas, 22, a junior staff member and former intern, also had a story from college. At coffee with a male classmate, she mentioned being interested in law school. He said, I don't know if women should be lawyers. I really think he just wanted women to thrive and very faultily thought that that's how women best thrive, she said. She retorted, that was absurd of you to say, because I think I would be a much better lawyer than you would be. It isn't only men. Anastasia Shanahan, 22, Ms. Begg's assistant and another former intern, was startled when two female friends said they were unsure whether women could lead. Of course they can, she said. The Luce Center, that's Luce, L-U-C-E, a donor-funded nonprofit, says its mission is to mold young women into strong conservative leaders, like the center's eponym, the Congresswoman, diplomat, and conservative activist Claire Booth Luce. With a new book, Campus Events, and other programming, Ms. Begg is trying to offer a vision of womanhood and marriage that she says avoids the false choices presented by conservatives and liberals. From some conservatives, including people Ms. Begg considers ideological allies on other issues, the message is a diminishing of women's intelligence and a discouraging of women from using their gifts, their God-given gifts. From some on the left, young women hear the denial of biological sex and the devaluing of marriage, motherhood, and family, she said. Many liberals, however, say conservatives like Ms. Begg are limiting women by emphasizing motherhood's importance and de-emphasizing the right to bodily autonomy, including for transgender people. The summer internship program, which is paid, offers Ms. Begg another avenue to counter what she sees as harmful messages. The interns don't fetch coffee or answer phones. Instead, they receive a crash course in practical and professional skills, alongside tutelage in conservative principles. One day is dedicated to media training and public speaking, another to constitutional law. In July, the interns visited the United Nations in New York. A National Review columnist, Carolyn Downey, came to speak about what she described as Gen Z's dangerous embrace of socialism. Later came training in self-defense and firearms and a tour of the Museum of the Bible. One morning in July, an etiquette expert, Lynn Williams, gave a lecture on silver table settings, asparagus servers, tomato servers, 5 o'clock teaspoons, what to carry to your gala dinner table, a lady does not walk with a cocktail, and when to blot your lipstick, before you sit down, lest you smear the linens, and before every sip, lest you sully the crystal. They practiced introducing parents to their future bosses, perhaps a politician or a judge, she suggested. They discussed sending thank you emails after job interviews. Given some of the careers that you all are pursuing, if you're here in Washington, chances are you'll be invited to black ties and white ties and other very special events where you're expected to know what to do, she told them, before elucidating the proper writing of a thank you note. As the summer went on, as the 13 interns debated their majors, next internships, and careers, their conversations sometimes brought to mind the mid-2010s, when the future is female t-shirts and tote bags seemed to be everywhere. Not so improbable, perhaps, given that these interns were raised in a world that had long accepted women in the workplace. Trading tips on hot yoga studios, gossiping about Taylor Swift's wedding, and comparing beauty products, they didn't sound so different from many liberal young women. But they were different. At a time when Gen Z women have become the most progressive group in America, these young women largely supported Trump's conservative policies, if not his character or the often misogynist views of the manosphere which has flourished with Mr. Trump's rise. Many young liberal women want partnership and children someday, but at the Luce Center, marriage and family were far more likely to be concrete, near-term goals. Financial stability and career success should not come first. At a time of falling birth rates, several of the young women said their faith and upbringings taught them that large families were beautiful. They embraced the idea that life was seasonal, saying that they would happily have their careers take turns with child rearing. Their aspirations, they said, could feel strangely lonely. They felt themselves scraping, sometimes painfully, against expectations and stereotypes on both sides. Mary White was debating whether to major in English or political philosophy. Law school or academia might be next. She wasn't waiting around for a diamond ring. But Ms. White could also see herself following her mother, who postponed her law career to raise 8 children. I would love to be a stay-at-home mom, but I feel like lots of times girls are belittled for wanting that, she said. Then again, she added, on the right, there's this idea that women shouldn't work. She liked the middle ground, she said. where it's actually a beautiful thing to be a mother, but it's also a beautiful thing to share your talents with the wider public. That was exactly the message that Ms. Begg hoped the interns would absorb. During the book discussion, Ms. Begg invoked Mary Wollstonecraft's argument that education and critical thinking would train girls for the professions, as well as to be wives capable of raising virtuous children. The women's rights advocate, she told audiences, said that we should never understand domestic life as inferior. The young women nodded, taking notes. They were only on chapter 1. And now we have an article called Trump Quietly Asserts Control Over Postal Service Amid Plans to Overhaul Voting. This is by Zolan Kano-Youngs, Adam Sulla, and Nick Corasaniti. 4 weeks before Trump signed an executive order seeking to restrict mail voting, he filed 4 nominations for vacancies on the Board of Governors of the U.S. Postal Service. All 4 were Republicans. 3 have expressed doubt about who won the 2020 presidential election and the security of voting. The selections broke with a long-standing practice of nominating board members in bipartisan pairs. 2 of those nominees are on a fast track for approval and could reach a full Senate vote when the chamber returns from recess in September. If confirmed, their appointments would effectively tip the board to a majority that's loyal to Trump. The quiet attempt to restructure the leadership of the Postal Service comes as the president and his allies are trying to transform the 251-year-old agency into a central player in their quest to overhaul the nation's elections. Last year, Trump took an unusually active role directing the Board of Governors to select the current Postmaster General, David Steiner. And the president has imposed a highly partisan agenda on a historically apolitical institution, restricting mail voting, a practice more heavily used by Democrats than Republicans, which Trump has publicly acknowledged would benefit his party. Control of the Postal Service grew even more critical on Monday after the Supreme Court ruled to allow the administration to move forward with plans to restrict mail-in voting before the midterm elections. The justices cautioned that the decision was preliminary and should not be construed as a final determination on the legality of the order. It also remains unclear whether the administration can implement the restrictions in time for mail voting this year. It's clear to me that the president is looking for people who will do exactly what he says and will carry out his order without respect for the U.S. Postal Service, said Senator Alyssa Slotkin, a Democrat who serves on the Senate Homeland Committee with oversight of the agency. Jonathan Smith, the head of the American Workers' Postal Union, said postal workers are worried about being ordered to implement policies that are legally questionable. They can direct the people I represent to follow procedures we perceive as possibly not constitutionally sound or legal or even ethical, Mr. Smith said in an interview, because the Board of Governors were put there for that purpose. Since he returned to power last year, Trump has recruited allies for key roles across his administration who are willing to act on his false claims that his defeat in 2020 was rigged and the country's election systems are not secure. He has pressed for criminal investigations of election officials in states he lost in 2020. His top legislative priority is enacting a law that would require proof of citizenship to register to vote. He has deployed the Department of Homeland Security to scour state voter rolls for non-citizens. Few agencies are as central to this mission as the Postal Service, and few are as blatantly straining the boundaries of executive power. The Constitution grants the president no authority over elections, an area of governance that only Congress and the states may regulate. Yet Trump has instructed the Postal Service to effectively police mail voting and decide which ballots can be delivered. The president turned to the Postal Service to pursue his agenda of curtailing mail voting as other efforts to do so face defeat in the courts and in Congress. He has urgently stayed on the issue in the midst of a daunting midterm cycle for Republicans, stating publicly that his party could keep control of Congress if mail voting could be blocked. In March, he signed an executive order that would grant the Postal Service the power to block mail ballots from being sent in states that do not comply. It called on the Department of Homeland Security to compile state-by-state citizen lists to help determine eligibility and instructed the Postal Service to verify voters based on roles provided by states. Quick break, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Roughly 2 months later, the Postal Service proposed a rule intended to implement a key piece of the executive order, authorizing the agency to refuse to deliver mail ballots in states that fail to turn over those voter rolls. The potential electoral consequences of such a policy could be enormous. A coalition of nearly 24 states, almost all Democratic controlled, and representing more than half the country's population, sued to block the executive order and have not complied with any aspect of it. When the proposed rule came out, Mr. Steiner also declared that the agency would follow any court orders governing voting by mail. But weeks later, after a federal judge struck down key provisions of the president's executive order, not all the implementation stopped. Although the Postal Service circulated an email to all employees in early July declaring that Mr. Trump's demands on the agency were legally void, a Postal Service executive said in a court filing that same week that work was proceeding to create the infrastructure to evaluate eligibility to vote by mail. Regardless of the ultimate impact of the Supreme Court's ruling, Trump has hinted that he is unlikely to drop the issue. In an interview with Wayne Allen Root, a conservative TV and radio host, the president suggested that he might try to test unproven claims of executive authority. Root said, "You have the right to declare a national security emergency for elections," referring to a legally dubious theory popular among right-wing election activists that the president can use such a justification for extraordinary measures, despite no constitutional backing for the measure. Mr. Root added, "If you do this in the next month, we will get photo ID, proof of citizenship, and a limit to mail ballots." Trump responded, "Let me just say stranger things have happened. I'll leave it at that." A spokesman for the Postal Service declined to answer questions about the nominees or pending litigation. The White House declined to comment. All 4 of Trump's nominees drew skepticism from Democrats in their Senate hearings or as a result of their answers in pre-hearing questionnaires. Ms. Slotkin said she was left frustrated by their testimonies, including that of William Gallo, a retired commodities broker and entrepreneur who hesitated in his congressional hearing in June before answering her question on whether mail voting was safe. Jeff Brodsky, a co-founder of a management consultant firm, expressed similar skepticism about American elections in his questionnaire. When asked who won the 2020 and 2024 presidential elections and whether it was free and fair, Mr. Brodsky repeated a phrase that has become common among those seeking to please Trump and continued to spread doubt about the 2020 election. That was, Joe Biden was certified as the president of the 2020 election. "I have no information to reach a conclusion that it was free and fair," Mr. Brodsky wrote. He gave the same answer for the 2024 election, subbing Donald Trump for Biden. Another nominee, Robert Steffens, a former top executive at Marvel, expressed doubts during his congressional vetting process about the integrity of mail voting in 2020, according to an official familiar with the process, who spoke anonymously to describe internal conversations. The 4th nominee, Anthony Lemangino, recently withdrew his nomination for personal reasons, according to a White House official who spoke on the condition of anonymity, although it's unclear if Trump has officially withdrawn his name. None of the four nominees have much experience in mail, logistics, postal operations, or public administration. Brodsky repeatedly referred to this shortcoming in his written responses to Congress. He cast himself as not an expert and only generally aware of issues facing the Postal Service. In answer to a question about the agency's statutory obligation to deliver mail to every address 6 days a week, he said, "I would seek to understand the Postal Service's operations at a more granular level, but today I cannot offer specific suggestions." Mr. Gallo cited his experience leading a roughly 50-person grain brokerage firm as relevant experience to serving on the board. The Postal Service has over 500,000 employees. Mr. Trump's efforts to remake the Postal Service and to replace its leadership have prompted some public officials to urge Americans to rethink their use of the agency. Senator Ruben Gallego, Democrat of Arizona, said he has discussed with community leaders in his state the need to tell people not to rely on the mail. Instead, they should plan to vote early and in person or drop their mail ballots at voting centers. He said, I never want to be in the situation where I have to say, you can't trust the U.S. Postal Service. We can't trust the administration. But Trump is willing to do anything. He doesn't care how he gets there. He just cares about the outcome. And here's a disturbing article. You remember that the Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier, has been in the outside of Iran for over 9 months. The article is called USS Abraham Lincoln Sailor Says Father Was Arrested by Border Patrol. This is by Christine Hauser. A Navy sailor on his way home after a long deployment aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln in support of the war with Iran said his father had been detained by immigration authorities in the United States. I've been deployed for over 9 months out at sea in the Middle East aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, fighting for a country that has given me everything, said sailor Joshua Aviles. He said his father, Luis Manuel Aviles, had a driver's license, social security card, and a permit to work in the U.S. We have done everything through immigration to get his green card approved, and we're just waiting, Mr. Aviles wrote. The Post has generated widespread attention, partly because of recent reports about poor conditions aboard the carrier caused by supply challenges following Iran's destruction of a U.S. Navy base in Bahrain. On Thursday, the beleaguered carrier, deployed in support of the war in Iran, started its journey home to San Diego, a voyage of about 13,000 miles. This is heartbreaking for me, said Mr. Aviles. I don't know how I can mentally continue working 12-plus hours a day, knowing that my dad is somewhere, possibly being treated like a criminal. My dad's only crime was coming to this country to give my siblings and me a better life. The Department of Homeland Security said in a statement on Monday that Border Patrol officers arrested Luis Manuel Aviles Roa on Saturday during a vehicle stop in Key West, Florida. The statement said the agency did not know when or where he had entered the U.S., but said that he was in the country illegally. The statement said he will remain in ICE custody pending removal proceedings. In his Facebook post, Joshua Aviles said he was notified on Saturday that his father had been taken to custody. Dad, I don't know where you are right now, but I know that I'm doing everything I can to get you back home, he wrote. I love you with all my heart. Please stay strong. I'm coming home, Dad. The sailor's mother, Argelia Aviles, told the Associated Press that Joshua's father, a handyman, was arrested after leaving his house to take his car to the mechanic. He has lived in the U.S. for 19 years, the AP reported. The Homeland Security Department's statement said that military service by an immediate relative does not automatically grant parole, lawful status, or immunity from immigration enforcement. A government program called Parole in Place has served as a recruiting tool for the military. It shields undocumented parents and spouses of service members from deportation and provides an expedited pathway to permanent residency. Service members must apply to be included in the program. Democratic lawmakers this month expressed concerns about the extended deployment of the USS Abraham Lincoln after reports about poor living conditions and a lack of downtime for its crew of about 5,000 sailors. Admiral Brad Cooper, who heads U.S. Central Command, said in an opinion essay published in the Wall Street Journal on August 16th that many of the issues were old news. He has also acknowledged the difficulty of the long deployment. Trump's second term has been defined by a crackdown on undocumented immigrants. An AP investigation this month said more than 50 parents and spouses of active duty service members had been detained during Trump's second term. At least 6 have been deported and 1 self-deported. Earlier this year, an immigration judge terminated a deportation case against an undocumented father of 3 Marines. And with 9/11 next to less than a month away. Here's an article called The Tour Guide Who Lived Through 9/11. This is by Michael Wilson. The tour begins outside a Burger King on Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan, and the guide explains why. People forget that this was commandeered by the police on September 11th, 2001, as a staging area amid the chaos. What follows is a very specific narrative of the events of that day as told by a very specific guide, Christina Stanton, who lived it at firsthand. She continues to watch it unfold 25 years later. The first stop, an elevated park just south of where the Twin Towers stood. I want to draw your attention to the yellow building back there, she directed a school group from Indiana. She pointed out 21 West Street, where she moved with her husband Brian in July 2001. They were newlyweds, living on the 24th floor with a fabulous terrace. She was 31 then and had been a licensed tour guide for 6 years. It was supposed to be my hustle, she explained. I'm a Broadway actress. She gave tours all over Manhattan. Her World Trade Center tour, close to home, began and ended at the 25-ton Koenig Sphere in the plaza between the towers. She'd once taken her mother to Christmas brunch in the Windows on the World restaurant, high up in the North Tower. And now the World Trade Center was essentially in her front yard. I'm here, she told another group this July. I'm living in New York. I'm living my best life. And then came that clear Tuesday morning in September. A New York City walking tour is a honed monologue of fact, trivia, and one-liners, maybe a pit stop for a local bite. Miss Stanton's tour quickly grips its listeners in an escalating tale of dread, locking them, often young people not yet bored on that day, into a breathless silence. The impact of the first plane shook our building, she said. She and Brian had stood dazed on their terrace and watched smoke and flames rise from the upper floors of the North Tower. Below, hundreds of people were stopped on street corners, looking up. Then a deafening roar in the sky raced closer. That went right over our shoulders, she said. It's hard for her to describe the ear-splitting scream of a commercial jet at such high speed and low altitude. She watched it tilt its wings at the last second, as if to strike more floors. The couple were blown backward into their apartment. I was on the floor and my husband was screaming, she told a couple from New Hampshire. She and Brian gathered themselves and their overweight Boston Terrier, Gabriel, and hurried to the stairs where neighbors, yelling and crying, were making their way down to the street. There, crowds ran past, holding briefcases or whatever they could find over their heads for fear of falling debris. What was I wearing, she asked the Phoenix group. Pajamas, a few teenagers guessed. With no shoes, she added. She turned to re-enter her building, but a doorman, intent on evacuating residents, blocked her way. Brian offered her shoes. No, she said, but give me your socks. They hurried downtown to the southern tip of Manhattan. Leading tours, she points west toward the sea wall, where she, Brian, and their dog came to find themselves facing the harbor. Then the South Tower fell. In an instant, the sunny refuge they had found was overwhelmed, and they were smothered in dust and smoke and debris. Miss Stanton, gagging and choking for air, found herself bizarrely remembering the fun facts from old tours. 47,000 employees, 12 million square feet, 40,000 doorknobs. We were running around in that, trying to find places to breathe, she told the couple from New Hampshire. Are we going to die? You just don't know what's happening next. And here in her tour spiel, Ms. Stanton's bulletproof cheer and love for the city can almost wave away all that dust for a moment. Has anybody here heard of the boat rescue on 9/11, she asked. Silence. Who doesn't love hero stories, she said. The harbor had quickly filled with dozens and dozens of boats, ferries, party boats, tugboats, family-owned boats, boats christened the George Washington, the Theodore Roosevelt, and the Alexander Hamilton joined the Frank Sinatra, the Yogi Berra, and the Chelsea Screamer in a massive and spontaneous waterborne evacuation. Some boats arrived at piers, others just motored as close as they could to the shoreline. Miss Stanton and her husband stood in line behind the Museum of Jewish Heritage to board a tugboat, but it filled up and left before their turn. Then a ferry arrived, It approached the edge of the seawall, but its deck was still a good 7 to 10 feet below the people standing atop the embankment. Two ferrymen lifted Miss Stanton, still in her pajamas and trying to blink away dust from her eyes, over the wall and dropped her into the boat. Brian and their dog followed. The ferry chugged across the Hudson River and dropped them at a place Miss Stanton had never heard of, Paulus Hook, New Jersey, in the shadow of the landmark Colgate clock. They disembarked and took stock. Two adults and a dog covered in grit and dust in an unfamiliar neighborhood of warehouses and industrial spaces. They shuffled along, pausing now and then to prevent Gabriel from licking the crust off his fur. Suddenly and desperately, Miss Stanton needed a bathroom. When the couple saw a young woman approaching a new-looking apartment building, they asked her if there was a restroom. The woman realized where they were coming from and took them up to her apartment. There they met the woman's husband, David maybe, and used their bathroom. David, stunned, offered them glasses of water, and the Stantons stood awkwardly for a minute, too dirty to sit, before they left. They walked about a mile past warehouses and over light rail tracks to a BJ's wholesale club. Inside, a wall of televisions was showing live feeds from the place they had just escaped. Customers gaped at the ashen newcomers who seemed to have stepped out of those televisions. The Stantons bought supplies, including a pair of shoes for Christina, because Brian had grabbed his wallet. Outside, a line of yellow-dusted men and women waited for their turn at a phone booth. The days that followed were a blur. Later that week, they were briefly allowed back in the apartment to retrieve essentials. They'd never closed their terrace doors that day, so the living room was coated with debris, bits of paper, receipts, a scrap of a balance sheet, a diorama of things that once mattered. Like many who could, they fled the city, making their way to Tallahassee, Florida, where Miss Stanton's mother lived. They stayed for a few months. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. But by spring 2002, she and Brian were back in their West Street apartment. Staying away never felt like an option. Somewhere in that chaotic time for the city and the nation, Miss Stanton realized that living in New York was not her best life, it was life. Tourism dried up after September 11th for a time. From her terrace, Miss Stanton watched the slow transformation of Ground Zero, and then her work, like her city, picked up again. She booked tours through hotels, event planners, and groups like Junior Tours, which caters to students. She worked all over the city, from Central Park to Little Italy, from Chinatown to the financial district. And eventually she reprised her former World Trade Center tour. At the start, it didn't go well. Nobody, she realized, wanted a crying tour guide. She got better. Those early tours had a just the facts quality, but over time, she gradually added her experiences from that day into her speech. The impact of the second plane, her husband's socks, the boats. Word spread on social media, and people began to request her tour in particular, and being a tour guide stopped feeling like a side hustle. 25 years later, the tour, like life, continues to evolve. During a stop with the Phoenix teenager, a girl raised her hand. "You said you were in that cloud of smoke?" she asked. "Yes." "Have you been okay since then?" "I have not," she replied. "The Christmas before last, I wasn't feeling so well. I went to a doctor who said, 'No, you're not doing so well. You have cancer.'" Testing showed Miss Stanton's cancer was consistent with the 9/11 illnesses that have killed thousands of emergency responders in the last 25 years. But it wasn't something that only happened to firefighters and police officers, she realized. They'd all breathed the same dirty ash. In 2025, she underwent a hysterectomy. It left her free of cancer. Then she received a skin cancer diagnosis this year that may also be related to 9/11. One could imagine that having survived the day's horrors only to face cancer and surgery almost a quarter century later, one would be done with that place. But Miss Stanton keeps coming back to the site of the attacks again and again and again. She often tears up, speaking of two friends at a brokerage firm who were dating and who died in the towers, or how Gabriel, her dog who hated everybody but his owners, was such a good boy that day trying to clean his fur. He was never the same. The glass had shredded his esophagus, she said. He later died of cancer. Why keep reliving that? Because the boat rescue was praised as the largest maritime evacuation in the country's history, It's been called the American Dunkirk. And there's a documentary about it narrated by Tom Hanks, and yet few on her tours seem to have heard about it. Because not everyone realizes that the numbers of illnesses and deaths linked to the attacks continue to grow, far surpassing the number of people who died that day. Because surrounded by plaques and statues and the reflecting pools in the broken hull of that huge metal sphere, she too is a memorial. I have some agency in keeping these things alive, she said out of earshot of her clients. I'm a tour guide. I have a ready-made audience. Who else has a chance to capture the next generation? The whole tour lasts about an hour. Then they move on to the next stop. She's done here for now, until the next group arrives. And now for some editorials. Canada said no to America. It will reverberate far beyond its borders, by Stephen Marsh. Friday, August 21st, may go down in history as Canada's Liberation Day. It was the day America came for us, and we said no. The trade negotiations between the United States and Canada had been moving forward in the weeks after Trump first threatened 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. But just before midnight, Prime Minister Mark Carney rejected the American proposal. He said last-minute changes in the U.S. proposed terms were unfair, uneconomic, and called into question the reliability of any deal. Canada will match those tariffs dollar for dollar to protect our workers and our businesses. It was a decision made seemingly on the spur of the moment, but the deep history of this country paved the way for this one critical gesture, a historic no. Trump's tariffs on some $20 billion of Canadian goods began immediately after his deadline passed. For Canada, the choice came down to either accepting severe but temporary economic instability or binding itself to a pseudo-democratic fiscal basket case of a nation whose only apparent foreign policy objective has become domination for the gratification of its president's slapdash vanity. But Mr. Carney did not simply reject the trade offer on Friday. He was openly defiant of the new breed of American aggression. We will not allow any nation to determine our future, he said. It was a unique statement for any leader in Canada to make. The country has long defined itself through its participation in global systems, seeing itself as a node in the larger orders of the world, the post-war transatlantic order, and, before that, the British Empire. Mr. Carney is taking Canada in another direction, emphasizing national sovereignty on every front, economic, political, military, and technological. While the Prime Minister's approach is certainly new, it emerges from deep reservoirs of the Canadian spirit. For nearly a decade, I was a columnist at Esquire magazine. During that time, one of the greatest discrepancies I noticed between Canadians and Americans, and Canadian and American men in particular, was in their basic idea of what earned respect. For Americans, the capacity to project power, the ability to make things happen and to win are the primary virtues. For Canadians, the defining virtue is toughness, the capacity to endure. The difference is subtle but profound. Margaret Atwood's work of literary criticism that defined 1970s Canadian nationalism is titled Survival. The coureurs des bois, the great New French traders who went into the impossible north on canoes looking for pelts, measured themselves by their ability to survive on the bare minimum in the midst of a vast, indifferent wilderness. These deep-running values, rarely openly expressed, are the undercurrent of Canada's rejection of America last week. The offered deal, or at least the details that have emerged, veered significantly from purely economic matters. Apparently, one of the final sticking points was an American demand that Quebec undo its French language laws and French language cultural protections. French in Canada is not a business matter. Its place in our nation transcends absolutely any market-based consideration. It's not something that gets put on the table. While the decision to tough it out is iconically Canadian, Mr. Carney's gesture will resonate far beyond Canada's borders. A gray banker, and not just any banker, but one of the leading bankers in the world, has stood up and said that there's more to life than a little bit of money. The power of that recognition alone at this moment in history cannot be overstated. Trump's world, a world of transaction and submission, is not the only world we all have to live in. The economic impacts of Trump's tariff regime remain to be seen, especially given his history of reversing tariff policies on a whim. But we will suffer. America remains Canada's leading trading partner. Mr. Carney has chosen suffering, but he did what Canadians elected him to do: stand up for Canada. It's funny to wake up relieved that you're about to take a beating. We will not go along to get along. The American president clearly did not know whom he was dealing with. He is following in the grand tradition of American leaders, starting wars with people they don't understand and then wondering what went wrong. And here's an essay by our old friend David French. Go ahead, Sean Duffy. Let your daughter go to Harvard. Take it from me, Sean Duffy. You can let your children go to Harvard. It would be good for them, and it would be good for Harvard. Ordinarily, I'm not in the business of weighing in on individual college decisions. But Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation, has made his family's internal discussions as public as he possibly can. The Secretary has a reality television show. Yes, you read that correctly. And last week, a clip circulated online in which Duffy and his wife, Rachel Campos Duffy, a host of Fox and Friends Weekend, and along with Duffy, a former reality television star on MTV, talk about prohibiting their daughter from going to Harvard as an undergraduate. The clip begins with Campos Duffy saying that she's nervous about her daughter Paloma going to Harvard. We spent a lot of time nurturing and providing formation for our kids, she said, giving them an environment where they are steeped in faith and values. It worried her to even think about dropping them off at a school that would undermine that or try to undo all those things. The scene then switches to a conversation between Duffy and Paloma, in which Duffy tells his daughter, "If I send you there, I think what happens is they have professionalized figuring out how they can take good young girls like you and, I think, corrupt their minds." Duffy told Paloma that she didn't have to believe what he believes, but he didn't think that Harvard gives students a well-rounded picture of competing ideas. Paloma's response was remarkably mature. "But I went to an extremely conservative school in high school," she said, "and I'm part of an extremely conservative family, and then if I go to a liberal setting, that's a way more well-rounded education than if I go to a conservative high school and then go to a conservative college." "But they're so good at it," Duffy replied. "You'll see young people go to a conservative school with a conservative family, and they get perverted and contorted." Lots of people mocked the clip, but I had a different response. It was relatable. I had a very similar conversation with my father 35 years ago. We weren't at the kitchen table. We were shooting hoops in our backyard as we pondered whether I should go to Harvard Law School. Like Paloma, I had grown up in a religiously and politically conservative home, and I had gone on to a religiously and politically conservative college. Harvard was neither religious nor conservative, was also in the midst of intense ideological battles, in which conservative students were sometimes ruthlessly booed, hissed, and heckled merely for stating their views. I've also had different versions of this conversation with Christian and conservative parents for decades. They look at the news of campus censorship, they see the left-wing monoculture, especially at elite universities, and they wonder if they're sending their kids into the lion's den. The concern seems especially acute with young women, that they'll leave home as Laura Ingalls and come back as Lady Gaga. Before you laugh at that idea, please realize that this perception is almost entirely the fault of elite educational institutions. They're the ones that have created a left-wing ideological bubble. They are often extraordinarily intolerant of dissenting views. Peers and professors do sometimes make life difficult for conservative students. I've experienced this myself, both as a student and as a lawyer. In my legal career, I represented student after student who was subjected to a sometimes shocking level of censorship, stigma, and isolation at the nation's most exclusive universities. Harvard has been one of the chief offenders. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, called FIRE, and I'm a former president of FIRE, currently gives Harvard an F rating for free speech, ranking it 245th out of 257 colleges and universities it measures. Sadly, 47% of Harvard students report self-censoring at least once or twice a month. 79% of Harvard students say that shouting down a speaker can be acceptable, at least in rare cases. And 32% say that using violence to stop speakers is also acceptable, again, in rare cases. That's a sign of a sick free speech culture. That's Harvard's fault, not Duffy's. And no one should think that the environment is all bad. Conservatives will make liberal friends, including some who last a lifetime. My 3 years at Harvard were also 3 of the best years of my life, in part because they were so challenging. In reality, the ideological monoculture is more harmful to liberals than conservatives. Paloma is right. Given her conservative upbringing, exposure to very liberal students at Harvard would have given her a well-rounded education. Her liberal classmates? Not as much. When you're surrounded by like-minded people, your ideas are less likely to be tested and just as dangerous. It becomes easier to believe that disagreement with you is a sign of ignorance or malice. But here's the key distinction. Intolerance is different from indoctrination. Radical peers, professors, and administrators are far better at stigma than persuasion, and mockery does very little to change a person's mind. In fact, for Christian parents who are worried about their children's faith, there is robust data showing that Christians with a college degree are more likely to attend religious services weekly. All this becomes obvious the moment you actually meet college students. I've taught and still teach at the college and law school level and at religious and elite secular universities, and not once did I perceive my students as little lumps of clay ready to be molded however I pleased. Instead, my students are people of conviction. The best students are full of both conviction and curiosity. They're eager to learn. The worst have conviction without curiosity. They're eager to tell me exactly what they think I'm doing wrong. Quick break. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. I'm convinced that every person, especially those of us who live in the world of ideas, should spend time in a place where he or she is a distinct religious or ideological minority, even when it's hard. It can be among the most clarifying and rewarding experiences in life. In a conversation last week with MS Now's Katie Tour and me, my friend Mona Charan, the policy editor at The Bulwark, reflected on her experience as a conservative at Barnard College in the 1970s. She referred to a quote from John Stuart Mill. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. When I was in law school, I appreciated the fact that my ideas were being tested by the smartest people I'd ever met. There was no way for me to skate through a conversation, much less a class. That was worth the scorn, as annoying and painful as that scorn could sometimes be. But few things taught me that I belonged there more than those moments when my classmates would say, "I never heard that argument before," or "I never even met someone like you." We learn from one another, and we still learn from one another. There are times when my friends and classmates can even hear the echoes of our longtime debates and disagreements in my columns. I was a conservative and a Christian when I met them. I'm a conservative and a Christian now, but I'm a better Christian and a better conservative because they tested me. In the absence of that testing, I shudder to think of what I'd be like today. To see what right-wing bubbles can do to the Christian mind, one need only look at the strident, conspiratorial, and often downright dumb discourse in so many parts of the religious right today. None of Harvard's sins justify the Trump administration's attacks on its academic freedom. And I absolutely wonder why a Secretary of Transportation has a reality television show, but no one should mock Duffy for his concern for his daughter's spiritual welfare. Watching that moment, however scripted it was, did give you an insight into countless conversations in conservative homes across the country. That conversation with my father many years ago was also hard, and it was more than a little sad. I wasn't just leaving my home. In many ways, I was also separating from the denomination I grew up in. I was leaving my home and my spiritual family. There were precious few churches of Christ in Greater Boston. I think any parent can understand this concern. But we made the decision together. I was going to go. It was going to be hard. I didn't know a single soul within roughly 700 miles of Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I went because of my faith, not in spite of it. My father and I quoted the words of the Apostle Paul to each other, which were written in an infinitely more perilous time for Christians. I told you I was from a conservative Christian family. Paul writes in 2 Timothy, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And I can't resist this one. The real Natalie Harp scandal is the president's information diet by Jamel Bouie. Last month, after a warning that there might be an Iran-sponsored attempt on his life, Trump secretly left Air Force One for a military jet when he was leaving the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey. His Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and his key deputy, Stephen Miller, were left to fly on Air Force One. Who did Trump bring on his emergency departure plane? There was Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, a White House aide, Dan Scavino, and Natalie Harp, the president's executive assistant. Harp was in the news this week after Senator John Ossoff of Georgia mentioned her in a stump speech as an aside to an attack on Trump. He said, and while the sailors on the Lincoln fight his war, while he fruitlessly drains our munitions and oil reserves, the president sleeps through his meetings. See, he doesn't want to do the job. He wants to build his ballroom and travel with Natalie on their apparently defenseless flying palace gifted by the Emir of Qatar. The White House pounced, attacking Ossoff in crude juvenile terms. But rather than change the subject, the ferocity of the response drove new questions about Harp's role and relationship to the president. On MS Now, my Times newsroom colleague Maggie Haberman referred to Harp as the president's comfort blanket, and that role appears to include information management, as Haberman noted in an article she wrote with Sean McCreish. As long as Ms. Harp is around, he enjoys an unvetted flow of information, some of it poisonous and counterproductive, at least as far as a number of his other advisors are concerned. She supplies him with content she fishes out of the social media gutter, like the video he posted depicting the Obamas as apes, and provides him with a view from the world outside official Washington, of which he has always been mistrustful. Her moniker is the human printer because she tails the president with a portable printer so she can hand him information in hard copy. Harp posts on social media in Trump's name and even responds to foreign leaders in his name. She spends more time with Trump than any other aide and reports exclusively to him and no one else. If the presidency is a job of crisis management in which the principal task is to deal with an endless number of fires of various sizes and scope, then the most important thing a president can have is good information to help him know what to handle, what to delegate, and what to delay. If Harp has as much control over Trump's information environment as she appears to hold, if she is the one shaping his sense of the outside world, then it is entirely reasonable to say that Natalie Harp is one of the most powerful people in the United States. The reason the Harp story has caught fire is that it's salacious. The elderly president spends nearly all of his waking hours with a young, attractive aide. But the reason it matters is that it's further confirmation of one essential fact of the Trump White House, that the president exists in a degraded, chaotic information environment. He rejects information that's gathered and collected for the purpose of informing him and is highly reliant. Instead, he relies on counsel from people who have no incentive to contradict him and every incentive to tell him what he wants to hear or what they want him to hear. Trump has dismantled every institutional structure designed to curb the worst aspects of the presidency, a tendency toward isolation and groupthink, and has instead sunk deeper into his own propaganda and invented reality. Harp, it appears, is a key part of that. A total devotee, she shapes his world. The result is a chief executive who is detached from the information he needs to avoid disaster, much less successfully govern the country. Accordingly, Trump has neither avoided disaster nor managed to put the country on stable footing. Instead, he is carelessly careening toward catastrophe. So far, it's only been a matter of luck that we haven't crashed. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the August 24th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. I hope you liked my selection of articles. There are so many to choose from. I try to pick ones that are interesting and informative. And I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to being with you again next week. Goodbye.